Good evening, chillins, and welcome to a night of spooky stories, a night of spooksome tales that will chill your spine and rattle your bones. I'm joined by my friend Jim. May he rest. This first tale, to make you quiver like a shivering lizard, is called The Naughty Nightingale. And it goes as follows. Nigella was a naughty nightingale. She wasn't evil or even nasty, just exceedingly naughty. She was a slightly bad egg who grew up to be a slightly bad bird, but only slightly. She never did anything too mean or grisly. Of course, she had her tantrums as with any other not quite adult. She always started singing early in the morning to wake everybody up. She never ate her greens. That's what they call the little green runt maggots that nobody really likes, but for whom you feel so sorry that it's polite to put them out of their misery. She sulked on her branch for days after she found out she'd have to go to Africa for winter. She had nothing against Africa, she just didn't like the idea of zebras. She liked to know where she stood when it came to the colour of things. That opinion had got her into lots of trouble on Twitter. Birds rather like tweeting, the naughty ones especially. She used to play practical jokes on neighbouring birds. She once told a fledgling sparrow that a hawk was coming. The poor fledgling threw itself from its nest, falling all the way to the ground right onto a hungry badger. It was more of a flop than a fledge. The hawk was, in fact, the young sparrow's mother returning to the nest. Nigella never meant for the prank to go so awry, but nonetheless she had to explain to the confused mother why her son was now rendered badger snack. As she described the course of events to the mother, a hawk swooped down and took the recently bereaved bird. Things do have a way of sorting themselves out. One day Nigella was out for a flutter along the river. It was a clear spring day and the bluebells had just come into bloom, making a pleasant accompaniment to the discarded shopping trolleys and body parts. She spotted an old heron wading upstream through the water towards a fish that was wiggling about after helplessly getting tangled in a mouldy G-string. His legs struggled forward one at a time against the heavy toxic stream. Nigella saw an opportunity for mischief. She swooped down and grabbed the fish in her beak and dropped it back in the water. The liberated fish floated down the river and passed between the heron's arthritic legs, distancing itself as quickly as possible from the musty memory of panties gone by. The heron made eye contact with Nigella and said, "That was rather naughty, little bird." "Thank you," said the naughty nightingale. "I'm not angry, you know. Merely disappointed." "Haha, you idiot, that only works if I know who you are." "Oh dear. Well, maybe this will hit the spot." The old heron's eyes went a dark shade of crimson, and a pointy hat fell from the sky and landed right on his head. Hairs sprouted from below his beak and formed a matted grey beard. He reached out to the side with his right wing. A small black stick with a white part on either end flew from nowhere into his feathery hand. Nigella hovered and stared at the heron. "Are you a wizard?" "Yes. Finally, a bird wizard, am I right?" "I was expecting a bigger staff." "It's a wand, you insolent songbird. If it's big enough for Stephen Mulhern, it's big enough for me. It's big enough to teach you a lesson anyhow." A yellow light flew out of the pathetic wand and filled Nigella. "What have you done to me?" "I have cast a curse upon ye. Until you have repented for all your sins, you will be forever accursed." Nigella's feet began to swell. The scales popped off and the space left vacant was filled by rapidly inflating flesh. The flesh grew and grew until her legs were many times longer than the rest of her body. Her body bloomed and her feathers popped off. The wings that once fluttered transformed into arms, and her tiny bird head exploded, her beak morphing into a large and sharp nose. "You've turned me into a human," the nightingale cried. The wizard laughed maniacally. "Ha! Forever!" "Thanks." "What? But I've stripped you of all your birdly freedom. You no longer flutter through the skies and sing the most beautiful song." "Yeah, but now I can play Fortnite and dab." "I don't know what either of those things are," said the heron. "Being a human's going to be great. See you never." Nigella strutted off into the town with a spring in her step. "Damn," said the wizard to himself. "I never was very good at curses." And that was the end of the first story. What did you think, Jim? Yeah, that's what I thought too. Okay, so this next story is called The Unexpected Guest. A tale so chilling that it might make you feel like a turkey that's cold. That's right. This one's slightly rhythmic, almost like a poem, so buckle in. Sarah Warren is 26 years old. She lives on her own in a house full of mould. As a single woman, she has no responsibilities at all, but all that changed on the day she met Paul. One night when Sarah was preparing for bed, there came a horrifying shriek. It tore through her head. "What was that sound?" she said, a voice full of fear. The room fell silent, but the shriek had been near. She crept down the stairs, her nightgown pulled tight. What could have made that noise in the night? The hallway was empty, no monster or ghoul, just a hanging portrait of her trip to Blackpool. Then from in the kitchen there came a rustling sound. Sarah's heart stilled and she crouched low to the ground. Through the kitchen door she saw the fridge was ajar. Nothing in here except mutton and a Milky Bar. Creeping close, she put her head round the door. A trail of dark fur lay scattered on the floor. What creature so vile has invaded my house? It was moments like this that Sarah longed for a spouse. Shaking her head in dismay, she reprimanded herself. "You're an independent woman," she thought, reaching onto a shelf. Frying pan in hand, she began to advance. It was time to strike. This would be her one chance. Throwing open the fridge, the pan held high, she stopped in her tracks, not believing her eye. For there in her fridge, chewing on some mutton, was a fuzzy little creature, as cute as a button. Eyes big and bright, so innocent and sweet, his little paws clutching his delicate feet. He was hairy all over, black as the night, and no pointed teeth with which he could bite. Sarah held out her hand and said, "Do not be afraid." She urged the creature from the fridge. He obeyed. "What is your name?" she asked the creature so small. He smiled up at her and simply said, "Paul." So Sarah decided that Paul could stay. He had nowhere else to go, for he had run away from a horrible family who made him quite sad. It was goodbye to his mother, sister, and dad. It started off well, the unusual house share. Sarah would cook, Paul washed dishes with care. But the mood soon turned sour, disagreements sprouted. Their conversations grew louder until they only shouted. "You shed fur everywhere," Sarah would cry. Paul answered, "There's clothes on the floor, you don't even try." Sarah got angry, for this was her house. Paul was being an ungrateful louse. "I want you out," Sarah told the creature. "You're driving me mad. You're being a leecher." Paul's bright eyes widened and he sniffed and he cried. But Sarah wouldn't be swayed, no matter how hard he tried. Paul left that day, leaving nothing behind. Sarah wondered perhaps if she could have been more kind. She thought and she paced until her back did ache, dreading to think that she had made a mistake. Full of despair at her possible error, she ran to the front door, her heart full of terror. But standing there, a face full of concern, was her next-door neighbour, a woman called Laverne. "Has something happened to Paul?" Sarah desperately asked. "You named that thing Paul?" Laverne looked aghast. "He introduced himself as Paul," Sarah insisted in haste. But Laverne looked fearful. She could see her mind race. "That thing did not speak to you," Laverne persisted. Sarah was confused. Her thoughts became misted. "How do you know?" Sarah asked, twiddling her hair. Laverne stared at her. "Sarah, that thing was a fucking bear." Sarah laughed at Laverne, and she shook her head. "Paul was too small, cute and cuddly," she said. But Laverne's revelation had held the key to finally open Sarah's eyes wide to see. The door in front of her lay splintered and cracked. In the kitchen, the fridge was broken, savagely attacked. Wallpaper had been torn and lain as strewed on the floor. All the walls were crisscrossed. They'd been carved with a claw. Sarah looked down and for the first time could see the blood pooled in her socks from a bite mark or three. There was no denying that Laverne was indeed right. Sarah had found a big fucking bear that night. "Are you okay?" Laverne asked to her friend. Sarah just smiled, for her ordeal had come to an end. "What will you do now?" Laverne inquired of her. "I'm going to buy a big Hoover. My house is covered in fur." The end. Truly spine-tingling, wasn't it, Jim? Reminds me a bit of the time we shared a house. I used to bring quite a few bears home. Yeah, classic. Anyway, this next story is a story called ghost poop. A concept that I'm sure we can all relate to. Pop, plop, plish, ploomf. Tam scrunched up his face as she made a deposit. 3 neat poops increasing exponentially in size, or so he thought. Tam rose to wipe. He wasn't one of these people who sits on the toilet for half an hour scrolling through feed after feed, waiting so long to rise that their rear forms a thin, crusty shell. He wiped and then inspected the roll, as one does. Nothing. How peculiar. He looked at the bowl. Surely enough it wasn't empty. The water was still clear. What had happened? Had his dung obediently launched itself into the water and straight through the cistern, travelling on its merry way? That would be nice, if a little strange. Very useful in this age of global warming and wastage. He chucked the piece of paper in the toilet and then flushed, realising too late that he'd just negated any of the environmental benefits of the event. Cursing his foolishness and shedding a tear at the photo of Natalie Bennett on the wall, he washed his hands, just as he normally would, and left the bathroom. Sure enough, the next day, Tam went out for his usual 12:07 bathroom visit, and the same thing happened again. Now things were getting weird. He'd had a curry for dinner, and leftover curry for breakfast, and an espresso for elevensies, yet no evidence afterwards. His stool must be harder than actual stools, as in chair stools, not poo stools. The same thing happened the next day, and the next day. He was beginning to feel alarmed. He decided to talk to his wife about it. Linda wasn't interested. He ignored what his nonsense about invisible poops and brilliant clean getaway puns. What was worse, she started to cry. He didn't understand. What had he done to upset her? He put out his hand to comfort her, but was shocked when his hand passed right through her. That was when it began to dawn on him. He dashed back to the bathroom. As he opened it, he noticed the transparency of his flesh. He looked at the toilet roll. Written above it, in ghost, was a sign. Tiny ghosts, 100 sheets. That explained the sad faces on the sheets.
That was very spooky, Jim. That reminds me of something that you would write.
Yeah, you are really good.
I miss you, friend.
Anyway, this next story is called The Final Great Journey. And this is the closest that this night will get to fan fiction. It refers to characters that you may know from a popular television program. This is The Final Great Journey. Loch 19. Heading out of Stratford-upon-Avon. The old acting days. Prunella sat at the bow of the old creaking narrowboat as it effortlessly yet slowly glided on the water, meandering as if there was not a care in the world. Of course, for Prunella, there wasn't. Her eyes followed the ripples of the water caused by other boats as they spread out to the towpath coping stones, and then she slowly gazed up to the pink sky. The silhouette of the theatre appeared hazy against the wispy, glowing clouds. "Red sky at night!" she exclaimed somewhat loudly. "Shepherd's delight!" a mildly deep and clear voice returned. It was Timothy at the stern, steering. Prunella, wide-eyed and mouth open in awe, turned her attention from the idyllic dawn sky to her beloved Tim, only his head visible from behind the body of the boat. Tim smiled back to her. He was everything to her. A doting husband, a mindful carer, a lover, but most importantly, Tim was Prue's canal buddy. The boat strayed from port to starboard and back before finally mooring just outside Loch 20. In the dying light of the day, Prunella clambered ashore with a thick rope in hand and tied up. She picked her leg and climbed aboard, ready to rest for the night. After looking around the mooring to make sure everything was adequate, she took a deep breath in before going below. "I've done us a nice risotto and got us a lovely wine from the merchant in town for us to have," Tim declared, amongst the rattling of pans at the other end of the boat. "Just like the old days, eh?" "Yes. I'll get a seat at the table," Prunella answered. "Not to worry, it's already done. All you have to do is sit down." Excellent," she mumbled as she went to the table. The dinette was looking as good as a table in a 5-star restaurant. Crisp, fresh, white linen draped over the table. A lone, single candlestick stood proud, the candle flame flickering ever so. She couldn't believe it. She was over the moon. She sat down and eagerly awaited Tim to appear with the risotto. A hand appeared with a plate and put it on the table. Excitement turned to distress as Prunella discovered, much to her horror, that the risotto was in fact a cheap, microwavable curry dish from the supermarket. "Not again! Not a curry again! We've had this now every night for 3 months! I can't! I won't!" she begged through gritted teeth. Her arm came up from under the table and grabbed the plate, throwing it at a spot in the wall which was stained with curry and had a pile of broken plates climbing up from the floor. Prunella got up out of the dinette and blew out the candle, sobbing as she tried to run off. She opened the doors and took a breath of fresh air. The tears soon dried and a smile appeared. It wasn't all bad. Later that night, after listening to the radio and reading numerous papers and a magazine, Prunella got into bed. Her silk ivory nightgown flowed and looked ever so elegant as she kicked off her slippers and cuddled up to Tim, who by this point was deep under the covers asleep. She lay her arm over him and buried her face into the pillows. The breeze outside gently rocked the boat. The silence throughout was only interrupted by some creaking now and then. It was as if the whole world had fallen to sleep. The rocking helped Prue slip into a slumber like a newborn baby in its mother's arms. 3:15 a.m. Prunella's eyes were wide open. She could not rest. The rocking had stopped, and no matter how many times she tossed and turned, she just couldn't get back to sleep. She sat up and shuffled to the edge of the bed, feeling for her slippers with her toes. Once they were on, she stood up and made her way cautiously throughout the boat. Through the moonlight glistening in through the netted windows, she noticed a pile of unopened wine laden thick with dust. She stepped over the pile of smashed crockery and microwavable curry as she was eager to get out into the fresh air. The doors flew open and her hands grabbed the handles at the side. She pulled herself out and gasped for air. The mist of her breath in the cold night air seemed to mix with a vapour coming through the door from inside. Such a rotten stench. "Time to cast off, Tim." Silence. "Tim, dear, if we don't go now, we'll be waiting forever to get through this lock." Prue jumped off the boat, untying the rope and jumping back aboard. "I've cast off. You can set off now, Tim." Again there was no answer from Tim. The truth was, there was no Tim. There hadn't been a Tim in over 3 months. He had in fact died in his sleep in the bed where his rotting body lay. The partially mummified head that poked from under the covers of the pillow had been kissed by Prue each night, unaware of the festering decay which she lay next to. The narrow boat veered into the middle of the canal. In Prunella's eyes, Tim had come out on deck and was manoeuvring the boat towards the lock gate. She smiled to the imaginary figure and stood up on the bow, declaring her love for Timothy. However, in reality, the boat was gliding dangerously close to the lock gate. "I'm glad we're doing this now, rather than having to wait in line with all those other boats. It's just you and me, Tim. Take me in your arms." Prunella's declaration started to awaken the other boaters. Prue laughed and took a bow of her audience. As the final curtain fell of her performance, the loose boat smashed into the gate, causing Prue to fall overboard into the empty lock chamber. As water began pouring in through the gate, her smashed body floated on top. Another boater climbed aboard the crashed boat in an effort to save it and the lock from any more damage. They successfully got it back moored before another boater, upon inspection of the interior, screamed in horror at the grisly discovery of the decomposing body of Timothy in the stained bed. The churning of water caused Prunella's body to turn face up. As dawn's early light began to shine upon the canal, a ray caught her soaking bloody face, smiling with blank eyes staring up at the starry deep blue sky. That reminds me of some of our canal journeys. All those times on the canal. Oh, you loved to steer, didn't you, Jim? This one's for you, pal. Okay, so this next story is called... Actually, it doesn't have a name currently, but it's a story. We'll just see how it goes. But no, needless to say, it's very spooky. Jonah watched his legs dangling over the concrete, hundreds of feet above the weedy pavement below. Leaning a lanky arm over the edge, he dropped the empty bottle of Coke and watched it fall, slower than he'd expected. There was a gentle plop as it rolled and settled in a patch of nettles. He grimaced, thinking about how if he fell off it would hardly sound or look like that. It wasn't an impossible idea either. This building had been off limits for delayed construction for months now. Do you ever think how millions of people must have eyelashes stuck behind their eyes? Jonah turned to Adam, only slightly disgusted. He had come to realise that Adam didn't like silence much, and that it had been a bad idea to agree to come out alone with him. There was no one else to steer the conversation. "What do you mean, like?" he asked. "Like, them stories about how people with contact lenses are always losing them because behind their eyes, and they have to get them pulled out by the doctor." "Yeah?" Right, well, I imagine it must happen all the time with your eyelashes because everyone has them and they're always falling out, Adam said. Jonah nodded, mulling it over. Yeah, and when you go to rub your eyes, sometimes people must actually make it worse and lose them. Exactly. That's so gross, man. A car pulled up below and 2 people got out. Adam wondered what they could possibly have to do in a place like this. Hey, is that... Adam began, peering down at the couple. Jonah looked harder, straining his eyes, but recognising them immediately. He couldn't believe it. That's Dave. That's Dave, Jonah began. With Miss Applesweet? I don't believe it. He knows I like her. Oh man, she's my favourite teacher. Jonah didn't really care. Everyone knew that Adam liked Miss Applesweet, but Jonah had never told anyone that he had feelings for her, or that she had reciprocated those feelings on multiple occasions. To think an idiot like Dave could have turned her affections so easily. That's disgusting, that is, Adam said. Jonah agreed, watching as the 2 made out a little too passionately on a car bonnet. I can't watch this anymore, Adam said, standing up and turning to leave. No, wait, hold on, I think they're coming here. Jonah felt miserable as he said this, but he was right. Miss Applesweet and her latest lover were making their sordid way into the building, and there were only 2 exits. One was meeting Miss Applesweet on the stairs, and the other was to follow his abandoned cola bottle into the nettles below. Jonah wasn't sure which he preferred. You've got to be kidding me. Adam dragged a pale hand across his face. No. The 2 waited for a non-existent solution to present itself to the sounds of the passionate couple making their way up the stairs. Adam turned to Jonah to deliver a possibility. There's a chance they won't get to the 3rd floor and then we can leave, pretend nothing happened and kill Dave tomorrow. We could. Or what? You got a better idea? Jonah sighed heavily, trying to exhale the rage that just kept building inside him. He shook his head vigorously. Adam resumed his place, sat next to Jonah, but it soon became apparent that the couple were not going to stop at the 2nd floor. Jonah and Adam watched the entryway from the stairs as Miss Applesweet and her younger lover breached the room in a lip-locked embrace. She threw Dave into the room as Adam and Jonah stood up to greet them. Dave sputtered on the floor, looking very confused. How could you, Dave? Adam asked in a tired voice. Jonas glared at Miss Applesweet. He felt like doing something drastic, but he wasn't sure what yet. Don't blame Dave, she said. I told him I was going to help him with his homework and then I lured him here. He didn't know any better, neither did any of you. What's going on? Dave asked. Adam, I didn't mean to. I didn't know. What's happening? Shut up, Dave, Jonah spat. Dave looked quite upset and Jonah knew he should feel bad. What do you mean none of us knew? The beautiful Miss Applesweet blushed and shook her head. I've had tracking devices on all of you for a while now. I've been waiting for this moment for so long. The wind whistled through the desolate building and for a moment Jonah imagined the floor collapsing beneath the 4 of them. They would sink into the middle of the room and be crushed as the broken ceiling fell on top of them. And finally, Miss Applesweet continued, I can exercise my lustiest desires with the 3 most bang-tidy supply teachers in the school. Jonah choked on his rage. I can't believe you. I really can't. But truthfully, he wasn't all that surprised and was suddenly feeling like he'd confused his horniness for frustration in the heat of the moment. And that sexual night lived on in their memories until the zombie apocalypse destroyed all 4 of them the next morning. That was lovely, wasn't it, Jim? It's a shame you didn't go in a zombie apocalypse. I know how that's how you always wanted to die. No. Anyway, another story. This story is called... Does this one have a name? That's not the name of the story, I'm just finding out. This story is called 2 Hawaiian Shirted Uncles Eating to the Beat. A short story. Sam Jaketon had always hated creepy Hoxton with his curvy, crispy, creepy trees. It was a place where he felt sad. He was a quirky, ginger, Coca-Cola drinker with a muscly bum and limp legs. His friends saw him as a round, rotten runt. Once he had even helped an unpleasant baby duck recover from a flying accident. That's the sort of man he was. Sam walked over to the window and reflected on his hazy surroundings. The dust teased like ravaging dogs. Then he saw something in the distance, or rather, someone. It was the figure of Jake Sampton. Jake was a glasses turd with a bald bum and bare legs. Sam gulped. He was not prepared for Jake. As Sam stepped outside and Jake came closer, he could see the smelly glint in his eye. "Look, Sam," growled Jake, with an eddy glare that reminded Sam of glasses vultures. "I hate you, and I want a cuddly toy. You owe me €9,767. Sam looked back, even more disturbing and still fingering the misshapen bottle. "Jake, I am your ghost," he replied. They looked at each other with unnerving feelings, like two solid smoked sloths destroying at a very computer science meeting, which had ska music playing in the background and two Hawaiian-shirted uncles eating to the beat. Sam studied Jake's bald bum and bare legs. Eventually he took a deep breath. "I'm afraid I declare myself bankrupt," exclaimed Sam. "You will never get your money." "No," objected Jake. "You lie." "I do not," retorted Sam. "Now get your bald bum out of here before I hit you with this misshapen bottle." Jake looked uncomfortable, his wallet raw like a doubtful, disgusted drink. Sam could actually hear Jake's wallet shatter into 9,767 pieces. Then the glasses turd hurried away into the distance. Not even a drink of Coca-Cola would calm Sam's nerves tonight. Boo! I hear you like Coca-Cola. Sorry, liked. I keep forgetting. Okay, so this is our second last story. Our second last story of the evening, hopefully, if we have time. This story is called Fog at the High Seas. And it is so spine-tingling that you'll feel like you've just eaten a bag of skips. After I'm finished writing this letter, I will be dead. Right next to the hand that is writing these lines right now, there is a pistol laying on the table that should bring my misery to an end. My name is Robert Craig. I am a radio operator at the Adventurers. Maybe the reader is familiarised with the name of the ship. If you follow the press, you will probably know about how the Adventurers and how it got lost in the Atlantic Ocean almost 3 months ago. The press echoed the event, highlighting the strange circumstances of the disappearance of the boat. While the boat was lost without a trace, the radio was still operating and receiving transitions. The efforts by the company owner of the boat and family members of the crew to find the boat has been in vain. It is up to me to explain what happened to the Adventurous, even when I fear that people will think me a madman. We depart from Boston's Bay on a hot morning in July. The weather on the first 2 weeks was merciful. The sun would hit the metal plaquettes on the ship and the crew would entertain themselves by finishing and drinking beer. However, on the morning of the second day of the third week, the Adventurous woke up surrounded by a dense grey fog. The fog would not allow us seeing more than 2 feet away from our faces, making seeing almost impossible. The captain ordered to stop the ship, fearing that we might collapse within another boat or even the African shore, as we had no idea where exactly we were. When I tried to contact dry land, things only got more bizarre. The radio seemed to be reaching the shore, but sounds that came out of the radio I could not describe with words. It sounded as if a primitive throat, unable to formulate sentences yet. It sounded like a language lost in time and space. That night, or day, it was impossible to tell what time of day it was exactly with the fog, and I assumed it was just a lost transmission, distorted by the great distance between the land and the boat. However, after some time listening to the transition, I surprised myself. I found myself sweating and feeling nauseous. The uneasiness that these sounds were causing on me was so strong that at some point I couldn't but want to get out of the room and get some air. As soon as I exited the radio cabin, we were all called on deck. An unidentified metallic noise was coming out from the water near. When we finally located where the noise was coming from, we realised that something was hitting the stern of the ship. We put down a light tied to a rope to see what it was. It was a man. He, hanging to the piece of wood, was hitting the ship, pushed by the movement of the sea. Once he was on the ship, the doctor of the crew examined him. He was alive and he should regain consciousness soon. We located him in one of the beds and returned to our duties. The next morning, the fog was completely gone. The sun was up again, and I checked the radio and I was able to contact dry land normally. That was the last time the adventurers contacted land. That night, our mysterious passenger woke up. The captain, the doctor, and I tried to talk to him. He was a little disoriented, but he was able to tell us that he was a sailor in a British ship. However, when we asked what had happened to him, he lost his temper. He started to scream, cry, smash everything that he found nearby. He runs out of the cabin and reached the deck. He was getting ready to jump off the ship when we caught him. We tied him up to his bed. He said then that we didn't understand and that it was coming. It was following him. The doctor said that the poor man had probably lost his mind after spending hours, maybe days, on the water. Just after the doctor had finished sedating our unexpected guest, the captain was on deck. The fog had returned. It was surrounding the entire boat, and it was even more dense and impenetrable than before. But that wasn't the most disturbing fact about this alien phenomenon. The fog was now black. Sealing was impossible. We released the anchors and the captain commanded to seek shelter inside the boat, fearing that the lack of visibility might make the men trip into the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean. As it was expected of me, I tried one more time to make contact with the land using my radio. The only response I got again, those uncanny voices that will hunt me until my gun puts me to sleep. Desperate, trying to make the sounds go away, I disconnected the radio, and only then I realised that the sounds were not coming from the old machine, but from outside the cabin. The whole boat was being lashed by those impossible forces. Then I heard a scream. I wish I had never followed that scream. I wish I had never entered the room where the castaway was tied up. I wish I had never witnessed what would make me question forever the laws of reality. Covering the poor man that we rescued and tied to his bed, there was the fog. It was so dense that I could barely see the man under it, struggling to release himself and escape. Oh, what horrible pain that poor soul must have experienced to wake up from the sedatives that the doctor gave him and scream in such a way. Slowly the man stopped struggling. When the cloud elevated and released the bed from its dark influence, only a puddle of blood and organs was left on the bed. It was now when I realised the cloud had a mouth, a human mouth that was smiling at me. I wanted to run, but my weakened brain was no longer in control of my body. The fog opened its mouth, and out of its mouth came the same cursed harmonies I'd been hearing from the radio. My brain, in one last attempt to keep me alive, snapped out of the insanity. For a few seconds that gave me enough time to run. I didn't stop until I got to the deck and jumped into the cold black waters. When I woke up, I'd been retrieved by a French vessel that dropped me at the nearest port in Africa. Here I have stayed since, as I fear to take to another ship and the horrors that the high seas hide. What happened to those of the Adventurous and its crew, I do not know. I can only fear the worst. I am sure that I disconnected the radio of the ship, and I doubt that there was anyone in the crew able to connect them again. Not even mention transmit a message. Then why does the radio still seem operative? The authorities and the press have tried to reach the ship by radio, but there has not been a reply. I can help no more. Yesterday, the same fog that haunted the ship when we found the castaways surrounded my own home. The fog vanished with the night, but I knew it was a warning. It is coming for me. It's only a matter of time until the fog comes back, but black this time. And I will have my skull pierced by a bullet before seeing that mouth ever again. We've already mentioned your love of boats, haven't we, Jim? Hold it together, Eddie. There's one more story. This was easier with you, Jim. This last story is a scary story. A story that will chill your bones. Literally. This is a story called Skeletons Want Skin. Skeletons get cold in winter. That's why their jaws are always a-chattering. That and because chattering's dead spooky. Dead like a skeleton. Skelly Bob was no different. He was shivering so much he sounded like a glockenspiel solo with only one note. The grave in which he slept was a fridge, and he was leftovers somebody had forgotten about long ago. But he couldn't make it till Halloween, the one night a year that skeletons can walk freely through the land of the living. He was just too cold. He had to sneak out of the graveyard without anybody seeing and find some skin. It just wasn't fair, he thought to himself as he clawed away the earth separating him from the surface. Why should they get all the warmth? Them with their bloody skin, lucky sods. He used to have some, but it all rotted off. It just wasn't fair. After 10 minutes of clawing and pulling himself up, one of his hands broke through. He felt the cool breeze against his phalanges. He pulled himself out of the ground. A family holding flowers were assembled around the grave. "Bob," the eldest proclaimed. She may have been his mother in a past life. "Is that you?" "I don't have time for your crap today, Mum," said the skeleton. "We all get it. You're sad." With that, Bob stormed out of the graveyard, heading for town. He needed to be sneaky. From Bob's experience, humans got rather hysterical when they saw skeletons like him, except for the elderly, who are so nearly skeletons themselves that they assume that they know you from bingo. Skelly Bob dodged through the back alleys until he reached the centre of town. Well, not quite the centre. The bit of town just off the high street where every shop sign is a minor copyright infringement. Right between Goodfellows Pizza and Chorley Fried Chicken was a shop with a glistening sign that read, "Fancy Dress." Bob didn't especially want a fancy dress, but reckoned he'd go for one, if fancy meant made of skin. Before he went in, he grabbed a passing alley cat to hide his face. He wielded the feline like a coquettish Frenchwoman would wield a fan. He strolled up to the counter of the shop. "Excuse me, madam," Bob said to the cashier. "Do you have any skin?" "Skin, outfits?" the woman replied. "Yes, that is what I meant." "We only have the sexy beach hunk costume, and I'll have to check your ID for that one, love." The woman went to the costume rack and picked one down, placing it on the counter. Why do I need ID?" "Just the rules, love. Could you take that cat down from your face, please, so I can have a look?" Bob let go of the cat, and it bolted for the shop door. He made eye contact with the woman. The cashier went such a shade of white when looking at Bob that Bob felt like he was looking in a mirror. She just about got the word skeleton out before she fainted limply to the ground. Bob had expected this might happen and put the costume on anyway. He looked down to examine the outfit he had procured. The beach hunk appeared to be fairly muscular and wore tight pink swimming trunks, not quite big enough to contain his oddly lumpy member, which poked out along his left thigh. That explained the ID check. The skeleton felt much warmer now with a costume on, but he got the impression people were giving him some funny looks. He understood. The combination of his skull face and explicit attire made him look like a geriatric with his cock out. No, this costume wouldn't do at all. He needed something much more natural. Bob opened the door to Bert's butcher's. A man was chopping meat at the back of the shop, but oblivious to Bob's entrance. Sellotaped to the counter was a piece of paper that said, "Ring for assistance," but with no bell next to it. "Excuse me, Mr. Bert?" said the skeleton. The man turned around. "How the devil did you know my name?" Bert was clearly not a man of intelligence. "Call it intuition," Bob said to the butcher. "Anyway, straight to the matter at hand. Do you sell skin?" "Not really. People don't usually like that bit." "How very wasteful." "What do you do with it?" "Well, I have a big pile of all the chicken skin round the back by the bins." "Thank you, Bert." The skeleton turned and began to leave the shop. As he opened the door, he was interrupted by the butcher. "Don't know how to say this, mate, but your dicks fell out." Bob went round the bins and found, just as he'd been told, a huge mound of skin and gristle. He got to work. With the beach hunk's costume tossed in the bin, Bob was feeling pretty good about his creation. It was warm yet breezy, cosy but not stifling. It was perfection. He walked out onto the high street to strut his stuff. "Oh, Jesus! Somebody's made a scrotum into a man!" one woman cried. "The end times are here!" a vicar screamed. An old man passing by on a bike began to vomit so intensely it started pushing him backwards. Within minutes, the entire high street was empty. "Why does nobody like me?" said Bob as he trudged down the road. But then he caught a glimpse of himself in the shop window. He was pink and lumpy. Grease and blood dripped down his body. Chicken skin hung off every overhang of his body, like somebody had dropped a statue, covering it in soiled handkerchiefs. This just wouldn't do. He should go home. He'd wasted his time, and now everybody hated him. He was disgusting. He slopped back towards the churchyard, shedding strips of decomposing skin with each step. Behind him he left a fleshy wake, a trail of dead crumbs. He was just 5 minutes away from his destination when he noticed it. The only 5 letters he craved more than Shrek 2. Morgue. Why should he mess around with this fake-ass chicken skin when he could get the real deal? He picked up a sharp shard of glass from the ground and walked inside. Nobody knows if Skelly Bob succeeded at stealing some skin. There's no way of knowing. If he was successful, he would surely be indistinguishable from any other regular human boy. He could be walking amongst us. He could be you. He could be me. Because what is a skeleton but a human with some skin on? You know, Jim, I think deep down that story was about you. Anyway, thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to these stories. I'd like to thank some people for writing the spooky stories. I'd like to thank Hannah Wesson. I'd like to thank I'm just going to rattle through them, actually, because I can't be bothered listing them all slowly, and also I didn't write down the author of each story, so I'm going off memory. I'd like to thank Hannah, Mel, Jim, Daryl, the Tsar, Sam, and I think that was all the stories. Thank you for listening. Have a very spooky Saturday evening. And see you never. Would you like to say anything before we go, Jim? Always so witty. Thank you, everybody.
I know you feel like you want me, and I guess in a way you do.